one of the things that you will notice on today's file is that the script tags are not at the bottom of the body, but the script tag is actually occurring inside the head of the document. So I made brief mention but didn't elaborate on last time about how where we put the script matters. And we can put it in the head, we can put it in the body, or we can put it in an external file. And we will talk about that a little bit later. There's a commented line right in front of me here, which really is about linking to your script when it's contained in an external file. And we will look at the process of doing that because it's generally considered a better practice to have your scripts contained in separate JS files, the same way that when you're doing CSS, you keep your CSS in a separate CSS document. So you have your HTML, your markup, you have your CSS, and then you have your JavaScript all in 3 separate documents, so everything is kind of neatly organized and contained. So for those of you who are anal retentive or OCD about having things super organized and well structured and documented, separate files really will make life better, because then you're not scrolling and scrolling and scrolling through thousands of lines of code to find what you want. It's much easier to make things a little bit more modular between projects, because then you can just link to that separate file instead of copying lines of code from one document, sticking it in the next project, and it's just much better when everything is separate. So we will be moving to that model later on this afternoon. So right now I have my script and it's occurring at the beginning of my document here. Now, as it's been put up here, this actually introduces a certain thing, which is we're using an onload command. So at the end of my script it says window.onload equals init. And what that is doing is that is saying that after all of the assets for this document have been loaded, everything that's showing up in the window, so all of my images, all of my fonts, all of my CSS, all of my markup, once all of that is in memory, it is then going to be able to run the init function. And then my init function is defined up here, var init, and then it's doing a bunch of stuff. Because if I just put these lines of code here, and if they occurred outside of that init, so they're here, they're in my script tag, they're perfectly valid JavaScript. But if I run my document here, we'll see that now, one, nothing happened, which might seem perplexing, except the JavaScript needs to run for it to occur. So at this point I can go, oh, it failed silently, because it's not flashing, it's not beeping, it's not yelling at me. But if I pull up my console, my JavaScript console, which is going to be under View Developer Console, but I can also notice it's Command Option J. So Command Option J, it pulls up my console, and we can see now uncaught type error cannot set property inner HTML of null. So it's telling me that it failed because it tried to set the inner HTML property of something that does not exist. Remembering that my code will execute in line order. Line number 12 says headline equals document get element by ID headline. So it's asking me to JavaScript to go through the document and find an element called headline. Tiny itty bitty super huge problem. There is no element called headline that's been loaded into memory yet, because it doesn't occur until line number 69 down here at the bottom. I'm just going to put a bunch of empty lines so I can move that up screen here. So we can see there's line number 69, h1 ID equals headline. So if that's occurring all the way down there, and right here I'm saying, hey, go grab it, well, it doesn't exist in memory yet. So when we put a script in our document at the beginning of our document, we have to be really cautious about asking for things that are not in memory yet. That's one of the very common pitfalls that we run into is we write a script and it says, hey, go grab this thing out of my markup. But that thing's not in memory yet because that line of markup has not been read. So the script is executing, or my whole document, line 1, line 2, line 3, line 12. 12 tries to go grab headline. Headline doesn't exist. Therefore, JavaScript throws me an error, and we can see now at line 13, because line 12 tries to get this thing called headline, but it's not there, so it doesn't cause an error as much as it says, well, headline's now equal to null, as in nothing. But if I try to say nothing, let's set your inner HTML. Well, nothing is truly nothing, so it can't have inner HTML, therefore I can't put the words in there, and then it's just unhappiness all the way around. All right, so if we put this back inside my script here, so inside a init will run. We'll also notice that my init function has been defined as a variable or as a function expression, because I'm using a variable, versus defining it as a function declaration. I put a version in comments up here as a function declaration, just to remember the difference between the two. So we have a function declaration where we say function init, parenthesis, close parenthesis, and a couple curly braces. And that's essentially the same thing as saying var init equals function, parentheses, curly braces. They're essentially the same thing, but when I do it as a function expression, that will need to occur before I call upon it. Because here where I say window.onload equals init means I am now accessing or calling that function. But again, if it doesn't exist yet, I can't call on it when I've done it as a function expression using the var word. But if we do it as a function, actually, I'm just going to change the name on that so that one no longer registers. Now I can use this one. So here, I can access, so if we were to put this function all the way down at the bottom after it, so we would say window onload init, and then I would have my function declaration. You will notice if you hunt through the source on people's web pages, if you look through tutorials, if you go through books, you will sometimes see inside the script that's occurring in the head where they're calling in a init function or something along those lines. It will say window.onload equals init. The next line will say function init. That's what they do. When you do a declaration, you can put this line, the window onload init, you can put that first instead of putting it at the bottom of your script. So the order will matter depending on how you define your functions. If you use an expression versus a declaration. We will end up doing both, because some days I'm in an expressive mood and some days I'm in a declarative mood. It really does for me, it seems to come down to mood as much as anything else, because even when I am frankencoding from multiple sources, so I'm grabbing functions and code from books and websites and other things, some days I will translate everything into expressions, which means I have to really think about the order and how I rewrite the code. And some days I will do it as declarations and just put it in, because you can kind of be a little bit sloppier that way. And it works, but the errors that can creep up when you use declarations often are much harder to track down. So for that reason, I try to use expressions as often as I can, because it forces me to be a little more structured in how I organize the logic in my code. But both work, and you can use both within the same document. Within the same script, you can mix between declarations and expressions, and nobody's going to come hunt you down and say, shame on you, bad coding. Generally, though, you should stick to one and just work with it, but you can use both. So some people will want to use this method. If I look here, pull up my console, we'll see it popped out the word yup, because it now knows about it. So when you use a declaration, your functions can appear at the top, they can appear at the bottom, they can appear in the middle, they can appear anywhere, and we have access to them. expressions have to be written out and defined before we ever try to use them. That is the distinction. And you can kind of migrate to the style that makes you happiest. Again, there is not one gold standard that everybody follows. Now, some of the people who originally are kind of the developers of JavaScript as a programming language do have some stylistic recommendations and rationales for doing so. And other people who are very active in the modern development community don't always agree with that, and they have their rationales for doing so. So apparently everybody's right, or somebody's wrong, or it's just a bazillion shades of gray. Last time we used query selector to access elements within our document. Today I'm introducing you to a different technique for doing so. Query selector is great because it allows you to choose IDs or classes. But in a large-scale project, if you go look up performance statistics, it is not as efficient. It's a slower way of accessing things. So if you have a lot of markup in your document and then you're trying to access a lot of those things on the page, query selector could be a performance hit. Get element by ID is considered faster, but it only gets IDs. Now, one reason why it works so well is get element by ID assumes that there's only one element on your page with that ID. And if there's two, it gets grumpy. But it's also considered bad form. If you remember your very first HTML course, it should have been beat into you that if you put an ID on something, it only happens once on the page. If you want something to happen more times, you use a class. So classes, so we can assign the same class to multiple paragraphs, but we would only call a paragraph ID equals output or something like. We would only identify one thing on our page by an ID. But classes, we can have the same class applied to darn near everything on our page, and it's all good. So headline is this H1 in my document. It has an ID of headline. Now, I did maintain where the ID that I have here, I use that same word as my variable name, so they're all the same thing. You can see how it's all highlighted nicely in Sublime, showing me that they're all the same thing. Now, technically, we don't have to. These all have to match because they match my JavaScript value, but this is just my whatever I want it to be, so it corresponds with this. So it could just as easily be SDF. The A apparently doesn't want to work. SDF, and it's still going to work. It goes and finds the element on my document that has an ID of SDF. So by putting an ID on my markup, it now gives me the ability to find it and do something to it. And in this case, I give it text. Because if we look at the initial headline here, it doesn't say anything. There's nothing in it. I mean, we could put something in it like Fred, run this, and we'll now see my document says welcome to week 2. But it does that because my script has now changed the HTML of that tag. Comment this out, run it. Now it says Fred. Fred is my headline. I can now use my script to change its content. Being able to change the content is really a valuable thing. That's how we can start to make a much more responsive web page. So we can have a web page that people go to, they click on things, they make choices, it tracks that information, and now it changes what they see. In this case, we're just changing letters, but down the road, we'll be changing whole elements. So we will decide we'll show a div of this or a div of that filled with different content based on the user behavior on it, so we can get a much more kind of customized, much richer experience. So continuing down the road of doing things through JavaScript that we can just as easily do through CSS and HTML, but we're going to do it in JavaScript so we can take advantage of now knowing, oh yes, I can do that in JavaScript. So right now we're just doing things because we can, not because it's the best way of doing it. We're going to set the CSS property of an element. So I have this nice line commented out here where it's object.style.css property equals, and then we put the value inside quotation marks. That's critical. Whatever value you're doing. So if you imagine normally when you do, say, CSS and you specify a color, you don't put the color in quotation marks, or you don't put like 50px in quotation marks. But here you would, and it's required to do so. One slight digression on quotation marks is you may have noticed that on my get element by ID with my headline that I only used single quotes, not double quotes on that. Inside JavaScript, when you're writing a script, it's completely user discretion or programmer discretion as to whether you use single quotes or double quotes. Both work. So you can use either one. And when you look through things, you'll find some people use double quotes everywhere. Some people use single quotes everywhere. Some people will use single quotes if they're inside parentheses, double quotes when they are after an equal sign. So they have their own little like personal style guide that they use. I don't care. When I use auto-completion in my software like Sublime, I use whatever quotes it gives me. When I'm typing it myself, I generally use double quotes because I have used so many double quotes for so many other things over the years that just is where that's what my fingers do. So if you see single quotes inside any code I've written, that's because the autocomplete gave me single quotes and I didn't change them. So now you know my little secret. So like right here, that was autocomplete. That's why there's single quotes up there. And it also reminded me we needed to have this little discussion on single versus double. They're equal. 1, 2, whatever works for you. Your choice. All right. So if I want to change the property of something, I can say now headline.style. And then I say what CSS property I'm modifying, and now in this case I changed my color and I chose ugly shade of red. Now if I view my document, I'll see now it comes up in red when before it was in black. So I could choose red, I could now change my font, I could change my size, I could change my alignment, I could change any CSS property that I can declare in CSS, I can specify in JavaScript. So there you go. Any CSS property can be specified in JavaScript. Now we're going to move into the section of the document where it gets a little murky, where I'm now using JavaScript to do a bunch of things because I can, but I quickly realized as the example I was trying to create here was growing that I was detesting using this method because it became so onerous and made me realize I'm going to keep doing it just so I can show you why, even though you can, it's not a good idea. The next thing that we're going to look at is creating elements. So we can use JavaScript to create, and then after that we will use JavaScript to destroy. Oh, that's where it gets fun. So when we are creating something, we use document.createElement, and inside quotes we specify what tag we want to create. In this case, I added a paragraph. And we can see then I set the paragraph's inner HTML to some text. And then I add that element to my document. It adds it to my body. So you may have heard me refer a little bit to nodes earlier today. But the way to think about it is our HTML document is composed of nodes. So once you get into the body, everything we add to the body is a node in that body. So currently I have body, then the first node in my document after the body tag is my headline, my H1. After that, I'm going to add a paragraph to my node list. So I'm trying to use the words that are used in all of the reference documents. because nodes and node list and all of that stuff, it's like, unless you've done tons of programming and other things, probably are not, common words in your vocabulary. You don't use node and node list in your social circles, most likely. But if you start looking up references to how these things work, that's all they will refer to as everything is a node. And you're like, huh? A node is an element in our document. And the list of nodes, or the node list, is just the order that they are in our document. So if I have 10 paragraphs, I have 10 nodes that are children of the body. So body, and then the first node attached to the body is my first paragraph. My next paragraph is the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So we can access nodes using array notation with square brackets and a number, but we'll be looking at that down the road. But in the meantime, we can use appendChild, and this will now add to our node list. So it takes this child element and appends it to the body of our document. So it says body, appendChild, and now it attaches this paragraph. And now it adds that to it. If I don't do that, the paragraph exists in memory, but we won't see it on screen. So if this is commented out, so we never say appendChild, I created the paragraph, filled its HTML with text. Now if I look here, we can see, well, nothing's on screen yet, so it's not there. But if I leave that document in, we can see now it adds that paragraph. So I have an H1 in my document. There's no paragraph here. But if I look up the source code for what I have on screen, well, now see, all right, maybe that was, pull that up so we have room. So we can now see there is indeed a paragraph. So this is the source code. So if you say view source on my page, view source right there, there's my H1. It now has a style attached to it with a color because we use JavaScript to attach a style. And I use JavaScript to create and add this paragraph. This paragraph did not occur in my markup. And if we can create something, we should be able to destroy something. But we don't use the word destroy. It's just more fun to say. Which we'll be removing it shortly. But I need a way to do it, so I added a button on screen. So I used 3 lines of code when, again, I could have just put markup in. And this is where, as I was doing this, I thought, oh, it'll be easy, it'll be fun. I'm adding things. It's like, okay, this sucks. I want more, so it really, the better practice is put all your markup there and then control what we're seeing through the JavaScript, which we will be looking at very soon. And then that makes it easier. So we'll get to destroying in a moment. So now I've added a button on screen, and it's like, hey, look, remove paragraph, but it doesn't do anything yet because it has not been told to do anything yet. But I put a button up there.
It makes a pretty looking thing.
Now, if we want our button to be able to do something, we have to tell it to listen. We have to tell it to listen for an event, so we use what's referred to addEventListener. In some flavors of IE, it likes attach event instead of addEventListener, older versions, and some older browsers as well. addEventListener is something that requires a semi-modern browser, not what would be considered like a cutting-edge, top-of-the-line modern browser. So addEventListener is not 100% supported, but for most web projects these days, we can aim for addEventListener as our target level of technology because the amount of traffic on the older ones is generally not that big of a concern now. And if you're going for any mobile environment, all mobile browsers will support addEventListener. So if you wanted to work on a mobile browser, then addEventListener is the way to do it. One way around the browser dependency issue is to, again, use a third-party library like jQuery, because jQuery then rewrites itself and uses functions so it evaluates what browser is being used to look at the web page, and then it grabs the function that will behave correctly in that browser within reason, but without you having to write 6 different versions of the same thing as you try and test for different browsers. So jQuery is pretty sweet about doing that. So when you're doing events, using a framework like jQuery can be immensely helpful. But for basic work, addEventListener, especially addEventListener and click, it's going to be fine. So we tell the button, start listening for a click, and when that click happens, call the click handler function. That is the name that I assigned to it. It's a very common name for your first kind of beginning click function, but the name could be anything. It just needs to match. So I have click handler here, and it needs to match the click handler there. You also notice that there's a comma false. This false refers to the capture phase of the event and event bubbling. So if those last few words leave you scratching your head going, oh crap, I'm in trouble right now, just accept that you put comma false and be done with it. And in most situations, that's all we will ever need to worry about. But what it is when you have events occurring, we're trying to determine, okay, if I click on screen, well, did I click on my document? Did I click on the body, or did I click on the element? And if that element was a div, is there a paragraph that I clicked on inside the div, and was there a span around that? So as you can see, we can have a hierarchy or nesting of objects. And the capturing phase and whether an event bubbles determines, well, what did I tell to listen for the event, and is something along the line going to capture or not? So we just use false. So you can go look this up in great detail. There's all kinds of dissertations on tech blogs about this. And afterward, you'll probably go, comma false, I'm good. All right, so it calls this function. Now, currently this function says remove child paragraph. So when I click on that button, it's going to remove that paragraph from the screen. And that's good. And it does it by way of the child has to tell its parent to remove itself. So objects are not allowed to delete themselves. Objects can't commit suicide. Objects are required to ask their parent to dispose of them. All right, so parent, remove child, parent node dot remove child, and the element. So the element asks the parent node to remove child, and then the remove child command as a parameter takes that object being removed. If we look at it on screen, if I click on this button here, we will notice that it will now make that go away. So I click and it goes away. We'll also notice that the button went up because that object or that element is no longer in my DOM. So if I look at my code here and see my code, so we can see there's my button. I'm going to shrink this just a little bit so it fits. Remove above paragraph, fun stuff to do today. So when I click on this button up here, you will see the paragraph, lots of fun stuff to do today, disappear from my screen as well as from the code. 3, 2, 1, click, gone. My HTML has now been modified. Now the saved document on the server didn't change. I only changed what the client or the user has downloaded. So the next person who goes to the site won't see that change. They will get the original page like this. But the user who already grabbed a copy, the moment they make that change, it made the change. It's gone. So as far as they're concerned, unless they refresh the browser page, it's gone. There's no undo for that. There's no, let's see, undo. Nope, nothing. Can't undo it. So we need to do something about it. Now if I click this button again, we'll notice that it actually popped up. I'll click it again and again and again and again because, I wonder what happens if I click a button multiple times and ooh, that looks kind of bad. Let's go see what's here. And cannot call remove child of null. So remember, remove child is trying to remove that element, but that element no longer exists because I removed it the first time. So paragraph does not exist. Therefore, it tries to remove it. Can't be removed. Gives me evil red error message. So we've now seen benefits of using the JavaScript, but adding and removing elements is a costly performance endeavor. So creating things from scratch and adding them to the DOM has performance implications. Removing elements from the DOM has performance implications. It's generally better to set things aside unless we're truly done with them. So we just make it so we can't necessarily see them anymore versus removing them. But if I'm going to give you a tool like createChild, then we should have a way to remove that same element as well. So it's good to know how to do that. So I'm going to go back to our previous version on this where it does remove it. So I want to point out a couple other things here. One is that we will notice that when I am running this, I don't really get any indication. I mean, I know it's a button, I can look at it, but my cursor is not changing. From a user interface point of view, it's nice to get, especially for desktop users, that when you put your cursor over something, you get something that indicates, yeah, it's clickable. It's like the pointer hand or something, so you know it's a link. And that's just nice. It's good habit. And if I look here and I look at a link, you can see how I go from the pointer to the hand with the finger. So I'm pointing at you, so then that is a nicety. Well, we can do that by specifying button.style.cursor equals pointer. So we're setting the cursor for this object. So the cursor that shows up on screen, which by default links will show the pointer cursor, but the cursor that shows up on screen is actually a style, and we have a whole bunch of cursors available to us. So we can look at those different cursors. So if I look at this now, I'll see that now I get the little, now it's giving me the finger. So that works out quite nice, and it's highly appropriate that it's going to give me the finger because we put our mouse over a button, so of course I expect that it would give me the finger. So now my cursor gives me the finger. I click on it, the paragraph goes away. I click on it again. If I pull up my console, I'll notice that I am getting error messages. So that tells me that I probably need to fix something. So to do that, what we can do is the same way that we are able to add event listeners, we also have an option to remove an event listener. So when we remove event listeners, we will notice that the syntax is identical to add event listener, remove event listener, except that the word add has been replaced by the word remove. So when we are done having something listen for an event, whether it's a click event, a mouse move event, a mouse down event, a mouse up event, double click event, and we have keyboard events that we can be tracking, touch events if we move into touch. So there's all these different events that we can keep track of. If we add event listeners, we at some point probably need to say, I'm done listening for that event listener as well, or that event. So once we've done what it needs to do, we say, hey, stop listening. So we say remove event listener. And to watch that and play, click here. I can click this now until the cows come home. And if I look at my JavaScript console, I'll notice that there are no rage-filled hate messages that the console is telling me. So that's good. So remove event listener. Now, what we can also do at this point is once we click on the button, going back over here, we'll notice the button still appears clickable. Refresh the page. It's giving me the finger. I click, and I still have the finger. But we do have an option of returning our cursor back to its default, the arrow. So now, got the finger, I click now and I go over it. It gives me the arrow indicating, it's not clickable in the same sense. So it stopped giving me the finger. So I think that's good. I guess I'm not pissing it off any longer. So a couple more things we're looking for here. We can see currently we're removing child. Now when we do remove child on this, we notice when I click, my button goes up here because that element has been removed. Sometimes we may not want to remove it because we may want to have it come back. So one of the elements that we can do is we can now set the display property of that element. So we can say display equals none. So now if I look at this here, whoa, I lost my cursor. All right, so now when I click, we can see it goes up. But if we pull up the source code here, so if I pull up my source, we'll notice that that paragraph is still there, but its display is set to none. So instead of having my display visible, it's now set to none. So if we want to change it to something else, so we can turn that property on or off. So we can see it's still there, which is different than using the remove element. So we didn't remove it this time, but instead we changed its display. But if you notice, the things below it shifted up on screen. Another possibility is to use visibility instead of display. So we can have display none, which effectively says remove that from the document flow. Pretend it doesn't even exist, even though it's clearly there in the markup. Visibility hidden means when I click, my markup doesn't change. So it leaves the hole where that element should be visible. So visibility hidden versus display none. These are two different kinds of things. Now, I put the link for W3 Schools up, and you can see they have some information about display visible and talking about even invisible elements take up space on the page. Use display to create an invisible element that does not take up space. So display none, visibility hidden. Depending on what you're trying to do, each one can have a different effect. So those would be two things. Both are right. It depends on what you need it to do. One is not better than the other. I've uncommented a little bit more of the document. Now I'm adding an input and a button after it, and this is where I was just getting really annoyed that I hadn't put a bunch of markup on the page, but have been adding things, because when I preview what happens next here, we can see that my input field appears next to my previous button because there's nothing in the markup to say it should go on the next line. So if I want to put a break in there, I actually have to create a break and add a break. And I'm like, oh my gosh, at this point, yeah. So it's better to create solid markup, create good CSS, create your form fields, and then use a bunch of IDs. So if you use IDs, then it's going to allow you to gain access to things. But what I can do is I can just comment out everything that was there. Well, it's not hurting it. I'll just leave it there for now. It's not hurting anything. We can see there's an input. I now have my submit button. It's just a button, but I called it submit. And add those two things to my node list, appendChild. Change the inner HTML on my submit button so it says submit, so we can see there it says submit on screen. There's my input field waiting for me to type. If I click, disappointingly, nothing happened. I'm going to add one more thing in that I didn't have before. Now that there is story, I will give it some base inner HTML so we can see that something was there. Now, when you're doing any of your JavaScript, remember we always need to punctuate a line or an instruction with a semicolon. So if you get used to typing your HTML where you just type things in and hit return, we have to remember semicolons. If we fail to do so, we will get error messages. But not always. Semicolons are one of those things that you can get lazy about, and the JavaScript compiler or parser in the web browser will try to make sense out of it even if you forget a semicolon. It tries to be a helper. So I've added some inner HTML for my story, so it starts out with something. We look at the page, it says write me a story. And I can type in here, once upon a time. Now if I hit submit, we'll see that Your story is once upon a time. Now, when we look at it, we can understand why, because it says your story is plus, and then it grabs the value of that input. Now, one thing to think about on this is what you might need to do as you start to imagine how do you do this when you have, say, 20 fields that the person has to fill in. And I think I put that arbitrary number of 20. And now when I look at a form with 20 fields, I might scale that down to like 12, because I remembered doing this before. Filling in a Mad Lib with 20 fields just takes a really long time and gets tedious. So you can do 20, but somewhere between 12 and 20 is probably our magic number, I thought. But when we look at this, what might be better is to, because right now it works, does everything it needs to do. But if I have 20 form fields, so I click submit and it captures all of those, and now I start trying to change the inner HTML of a bunch of paragraphs so it puts this text in, now that's going to get tricky, because I can't make my story.innerHTML be like 20 paragraphs long with a bunch of information in there, because it will fail. It will just kind of truncate after a while, go, no, that's too big, too many letters in one text variable, so I don't like you anymore, and it will fail. So what we need to do is perhaps break it into more manageable chunks. And also, so you'd have paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3. So paragraph 1.inner, so story paragraph 1 inner HTML equals blah 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 blah. Story paragraph 2 inner HTML equals blah 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 blah. And we'd start structuring that way. And as you build your project, a lot of this will start to become a little bit more apparent. But another thing we could do is we could even go var first noun equals, then put value, and then we say first noun. So we create variables to represent the values of everything, so it's easier to stick them into our documents versus going input 1.value, input 2.value, input 3, and make those values have names. The more kind of descriptive names that you use for your variables, for your input fields, the easier it will be to write your program, because when you have 12 or 20 form fields, if it's form 1, form 2, form 3, form 4, form 5, etc., and then it's form 1.value, form 2.value, that really doesn't help. But if you start thinking about what it's supposed to represent in your story, whether it's name 1, name 2, noun, or an action, so an action verb, or adjective, a color, so you're pretty descriptive in your naming, the easier it is going to be to write what you do. But technically right now you have enough to construct your Mad Lib. You have everything you need. You can change the HTML. You have inputs where you can go grab the value of that input. You can now use that value inside a string. You can populate things, and you can start constructing a short, whimsical narrative.